I'm Rabbi Jessica Graff. I'm the senior rabbi here at Congregation Shereth Israel. And hello to all of you who are in this room. Hello to the large number of people who are joining us from their own living rooms, wherever you are. We welcome you into this space. We're waiting just a moment for our guest who is getting a drink, and he will be right up here with us. Yossi Klein Halevi is just navigating all of the spaces in this building. He's a cocktail, I hope so. He's here. I just saw him. I just spent some time with him, and he'll just be up in 1 minute. So thank you for being so punctual, and for it's kind of ironic that as we gather tonight for the Rabbi Martin Wiener Memorial Lecture, we are starting late, because he was the most punctual human being ever on planet Earth. And I want to say an especially big welcome to Marty's daughter, son-in-law, who are here. And I know that Yossi was in Seattle last week, I think, with Rabbi Danny Wiener and his congregation as well. So it's really, it's an especially big privilege to be able to welcome. There we go. To be able to welcome. I said you were on your way up, and we have lots of staircases here. So I was just, I was saying it's ironic that we're beginning the Rabbi Martin Wiener Memorial Lecture a few minutes late, because he was the most punctual person ever on the planet. He, on the occasion of my bat mitzvah and every other barn bat mitzvah that took place right on this very bima, used to call popcorn. Did he do this at home? Okay, so remember popcorn, where you would dial P-O-P? Okay, so he would always dial popcorn 3 minutes before the bat mitzvah was supposed to start, to check the time and to line people up and to come up. So, I don't know, they say the next generation has to push back and do it their own way, right? So, so we're starting a few minutes late, and I apologize. Rabbi Wiener, you are here with us, and I'm sorry that we're starting late. I'm delighted to have all of you here. I was just introducing myself, and I'll introduce you in just a moment. But first, I want to say thank you for coming on this really important evening. It was Rabbi Wiener's belief that Judaism would bring us a framework, a worldview through which to explore and engage with all of the important things that were happening in life. He pushed us to think about what the next frontier would be, and the changes necessary in Judaism and in our Jewish lives. So it feels particularly fitting on this evening to be able to welcome our wonderful guest, Yossi Klein Halevi, who's with us to help challenge us, to interest us, to push us forward, to engage us in Judaism, as Rabbi Wiener loved to do, as he spent his life and his career doing here. So welcome.
Thank you.
Here's the formal introduction. Okay. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 150 Muslim leaders have participated in the unique program. He is co-host together with Daniel Hartman and Alana Stein-Hain of the Hartman Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake. The 2013 book that I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have read numerous times, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. And a follow-up book, another book later on, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was published in 2018, you said, and in 2019 followed up with a wonderful part 2, which was a Palestinian response to these letters. So it's a very important book in contemporary conversation about Israel and the Palestinians. Yossi has written for leading op-ed pages in North America, is a former contributing editor to The New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world, and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in the American Jewish community and on North American campuses. Yossi is a recipient of the 2019 Figure of Reconciliation Award of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. Born in Brooklyn, he received his BA in Jewish Studies from Brooklyn College and his MS in Journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife Sarah, who helps direct a center for Jewish meditation. They have 3 children and, most importantly, 1 grandchild. As a brand new Saba, new grandfather, we are so fortunate to have you in North America. We thank your grandchild for bringing you over this direction. In addition to all of these significant formal accolades, I'll just say that you are known as one of the foremost thinkers on modern Israeli society. And you are an observer of contemporary life in Israel, and we are so honored to have you here today, tonight, to talk to us about Israel at 75.
Well, thank you, Rabbi, and good evening, everyone. I'm truly honored to be here for the first annual commemoration lecture in memory of Rabbi Wiener, who I didn't have the privilege of knowing. I do know his son, Danny. In fact, I spoke at his synagogue last week in Seattle, and I asked Danny to tell me something about his father, and he said, my father was a rabbi's rabbi, and I later got confirmation of that from a friend of mine, John Moskowitz, who was the rabbi for many years at Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto, who he said, oh yeah, Rabbi Wiener, he wrote my letter of recommendation to rabbinical school. And Danny said as well that his father had deep humility, which doesn't always go together with someone in a public space, in a public role. And the last thing that I remember that he said was that, I said, what was your father known for as a rabbi? And he said, well, he loved the Jewish people and he loved people. And that's really what stays with me.
Beautiful. So. I think he also loved Israel, and he loved the Jewish presence, and he loved to teach us what that might look like, how to challenge ourselves to think about that. Right. So you're the perfect person to be here. Let's talk first about the title of this evening as we recognize the 75th anniversary of Israel. What's significant about that? What does it mean? Where are we at as a 75-year-old country?
So the only way that I can really answer that question is personally. Because when I think about Israel, and I think this is true for many of us, Israel is so much a part of our being, our Jewishness, that it's really impossible to think of a contemporary Jewish identity that's somehow distinct from Israel. And so for me, if I had to think of one word that summed up my relationship to Israel, it wouldn't be love, and it wouldn't even be pride, it would be gratitude. And I say gratitude because I come from a Holocaust survivor family, as do you, Rabbi. And growing up in the 1960s in Brooklyn, in such close proximity to the end of the war, I was acutely aware in the most personal way possible of the brokenness of the Jewish people and the extraordinary success story of both Israel and American Jewry, both of these powerful communities emerging simultaneously after the Holocaust. American Jewry, of course, has a much longer history, but certainly the American Jewry that we know today, the self-confidence, the community that feels so integrated into American society on the one hand, and so comfortable in its Jewishness on the other. This is a post-Holocaust development. And it was really the relationship between the two flags on the bima, that metaphor of the two forces working together that helped heal the Jewish people. And so this overwhelming sense of gratitude, both for Israel and for American Jewry, that I feel as someone who grew up in the American Jewish community and then chose to become an Israeli. And sometimes I think about the two passports that I carry with me. And these are the two dream passports of the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years. On the one hand, to have a passport of an independent Jewish state, and on the other, a passport of a country that fully, unconditionally accepts the Jewish people. And so here I am, just taking that for granted as the passports that are in my backpack. So the sense of deep gratitude for being alive at this time, for being part of the most interesting and heterogeneous Jewish community, I think, in history. That's a big statement, but I can't think of any Jewish community aside from the state of Israel that is as heterogeneous, that has so many different kinds of Jews as Israel. I feel gratitude to Israel for teaching the Jewish people how to defend themselves. And I even feel gratitude for being part of a generation that has to grapple with some of the really difficult consequences of Jewish sovereignty. That too, in its own way, is reason for celebration.
So 75 years into the Jewish state, where are we now? What's going on in Israel in your explanation of where the state is currently?
Well, I think the way in which hundreds of thousands of Israelis chose to celebrate the 75th is really indicative of this very complicated moment. Rather than just celebrate, many Israelis combined celebration with protest. There was a big protest celebration in Tel Aviv of several 100,000 people. And that, for me, really, in some way, sums up this very complicated moment. Because on the one hand, unequivocal pride and joy. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, deep anxiety, anger at a government that I don't regard as morally legitimate, and I've never felt that way about any government in Israel, left, right, or center, and I've successively voted for left, right, and center over the years. There was never any problem for me of moral legitimacy. A government is elected, it has moral legitimacy. But this is a government of scoundrels. That's the only way that I can put it. It is a government headed by a prime minister on trial for corruption who dares to initiate the most far-reaching judicial changes in the country's history. For my part, a prime minister on trial for corruption should not be allowed to touch the judicial system, even if the reforms he were suggesting were legitimate, and the reforms that he's suggesting, as far as I'm concerned, are very far from that. This is a government where the minister in charge of the police was denied the right to be drafted by the IDF because the army feared putting a gun in his hands. And now we've placed the police in his hands. This is a government that speaks in the name of hyper-Zionism, ultra-nationalism, the most Zionist government we've ever had, and yet it's headed by men, and they're all men, most of whom have either served minimally in the army or not at all. There was never an Israeli government where you had cumulatively less military experience among its leaders than this government. And this is the government that speaks in the name of Zionism and nationalism. And so for all those reasons, and many, many more, I find this government not just appalling, but morally illegitimate, and it doesn't represent me. And that's something, this is my 40th year as an Israeli. I never thought I would say that out loud. I never thought I would think it. And yet that's where I am, and many, many Israelis are there as well.
How did Israel get here?
So there's the short and simplistic answer, which is something that I held on to for the first period after this election, which is it's all Netanyahu's fault. And he has brought us to the brink of the abyss because he has a need to extricate himself from his legal problems. And it's all about power and his own survival. And there's an irony here that Netanyahu was the prime minister of Jewish survival. He was the prime minister who was going to save Israel from Iran. He was the prime minister who spoke in the name of Jewish power. And yet in the end, it's all come down to his own survival and his own political power. And the rest, and the consequences be damned. And that, I think, is true, but only partly true. We could not have come to this point if it was only Netanyahu. There were deep distortions that were left untended for decades in Israeli society, in Israeli politics, and I would go so far as to say deep distortions in Jewish theology that were left unchallenged for centuries, that have all converged on this government. And I've really been trying to understand how we got here, what this government represents. And in one way, I think that this is a government, an expression of the woundedness, the unresolved traumas of Jewish history, which many of us, I think, thought were on their way to being healed. You know, we're powerful now. We're the great success story. We're so successful that our power is now seen as a problem by many people in the world, even by some Jews. We're so successful in America that it's hard for Jews to be accepted in the intersectional world. Jews aren't seen as victims anymore, which I personally celebrate as the son of a survivor. I don't think our place is in the world of victimhood. I think that's antithetical to who we are as a people. And nevertheless, we are carrying with us deep wounds and deep anger and deep hostility to the non-Jewish world. And that's when I look at this government, that's what I see. The word that when I was growing up was normative in Jewish discourse, which was goyim, which was an all-purpose term for anyone who wasn't Jewish. Now we use a more polite word, non-Jews, which is also, if you think about it, a ludicrous term. There's no such thing as non-Jews. No one identifies themselves as non-Jews. And, but we divide the world, well, there are the Jews, and then there's that small part of the world known as non-Jews. And so for me, growing up in a ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Borough Park, and growing up very much in an angry Jewish mode, I grew up on the far fringes of the Jewish right. I was a follower of Meir Kahane when I was a teenager. I was in the Jewish Defense League in the late 1960s and early 70s, and I like the looks that people just gave each other. I do that to get that reaction. And so when I think about the rage that I felt growing up toward the non-Jewish world, I see that mindset expressed in this government. That sense of wariness and hostility and fear of the non-Jewish world. The non-Jewish world is our enemy. And that's embedded deeply in centuries or millennia of Jewish theology. And this government is forcing me to ask hard questions. As a religious Jew, it's forcing me to ask questions of what do we do with the fact that our tradition is filled with quotes, with verses that emphasize the separatism between Jews and the rest of the world, emphasize the hostility and innate hostility of the non-Jews toward the Jewish people, which the Holocaust seemed to confirm. And yet, the two flags on the bima tell a very different message. And the message of the two flags was, after the Holocaust, the Jews can no longer remain ghettoized and separate from the rest of the world. For me, that's the spiritual message of the two flags. That and what an extraordinary act of courage for the Jewish people after the Holocaust, despite the Holocaust, to say, we're going to insist on finding our place in relationship with the non-Jewish world. In America, in literal intimacy with the non-Jewish world. My wife is a convert to Judaism. And in Israel, as part of the community of nations. Not always easily, not always happily, but still. And so Zionism and the alliance, the post-Holocaust alliance between the two flags, was a rejection of the Jewish mindset that this government represents. And for me, that's how we got to this point, because there was that untended wound that in the community that I grew up in, which has now taken over the government of Israel. And I look at this government and I see myself as a teenager. I see the world of my Jewish world of the 1960s, that meeting point between survivors, the Jewish far right, Jewish militancy, the ultra-Orthodox world. That's the coalition.
In January, The Atlantic published an article that you wrote called "Netanyahu's Betrayal of Democracy is a Betrayal of Israel." And you wrote in this article, "These days, as Israel faces another historic internal crisis, I find myself thinking a great deal about the summer of '82. Then we lost our unity in the face of an external threat. Now we've lost our unifying identity as a Jewish and democratic state." What did you mean?
So the summer of 1982 was the beginning of the First Lebanon War, and that was the first and fortunately only war that Israel ever fought, which not only failed to bring us together, but was actually the reason for tearing us apart. I made Aliyah, I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982, in Israel that was tearing itself apart. And it was one of the lowest points in the history of the cohesiveness of Israeli society. Things really felt like they were falling apart. Left versus right, Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi. And there was really this sense that we're not holding together. That if we're going to tear each other apart over a war, if we can't agree on war, an external threat, then what can possibly hold Israel together? And fortunately, we got through that deep rupture. But for me personally, the experience of joining Israeli society at precisely the moment when it was tearing itself apart has made me extremely sensitive to the need to hold Israeli society at least minimally together, because I saw how easily we can fall apart. And the next time that happened to us was after the Rabin assassination. And now we're in the third iteration of this sense of the center coming apart. And what's, in a way, what makes this even more frightening than the previous ruptures, than Lebanon '82 and Rabin's assassination in '95, is that in the past we were arguing over policies. Peace, settlements, war with the PLO in 1982. Those were all policies. What we're really arguing about today is identity, the identity of the state. What do we mean by Israel as a democracy? What do we mean by Israel as a Jewish state? And in one sense, I think it's necessary and quite moving that this is happening at the 75th anniversary. We're finally growing up. We're finally asking the hard questions that we should have really asked in 1951. And had we asked those questions in 1951, we might have had a constitution. And we might have been able to forestall at least some of what's happening now. But finally, we are facing the deep questions of what does it mean when we call ourselves a Jewish and democratic state? How do those two identities fit together? And they coexist uneasily. And what do we mean by each of those identities as distinct identities? So that's really why this is such a frightening time, and why I think it's evoking such profound animus on the streets. And the divide in Israel today is ferocious, and there is a deep fear of violence.
So later in that Atlantic article, you wrote, "This last election exposed two opposing visions of a Jewish state. For the ultra-Orthodox and the ultra-nationalists, Israel is the state of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism. For classical Zionism, though, Israel was intended to be the state of the Jewish people, with no imposed uniform notion of authentic Jewish identity." Can you explain to us what this rupture is that you're seeing in Israeli society?
So let's go back for a moment to the 19th century when Zionism first emerged. And Zionism, of course, was the ideology of Jewish statehood. But there was a second move that we need to pay much closer attention to. And that was the statement that Zionism was making about Jewish identity. What happened in the 19th century was that the shared religious identity that was based on rabbinic Judaism, that held the Jewish people together for 1,700 years of exile, began to come apart in the 19th century. And if you think about the extraordinary achievement of rabbinic Judaism, it allowed Jews from Poland to Yemen to share a common language. And rabbinic Judaism kept the Jewish people together through 1,700 years of dispersion. It's an unprecedented achievement, and the debt that we owe rabbinic Judaism is profound. But beginning in the 19th century, religion stopped holding us together and became the deepest source of what divides us as a people. Zionism comes along, and it's providential. Zionism comes along at precisely the moment when rabbinic Judaism unravels as the source of our cohesiveness and offers an alternative vision of Jewish cohesiveness, which is based very simply on Jewish peoplehood. If you are part of the Jewish people, and Zionism never defined it deliberately, kept that definition very open-ended, if you're part of the Jewish people, then you're in. The noun is Jew, and how you identify yourself, what kind of Jew you are, is the adjective. Now, this was a rebellion against rabbinic Judaism, and the ultra-Orthodox, who almost uniformly opposed Zionism, were right from their point of view, because Zionism was offering not only an alternative identity, but an alternative source of Jewish authority. It wasn't the rabbis, the Orthodox rabbis anymore. It was going to be political leaders of a national movement. And so Zionism comes along and offers the Jewish people a new way to hold together. And the legal expression of that vision in the state of Israel today is the law of return. The law of return is a very radical statement about belonging, who belongs to the Jewish people. And the law of return is in its most basic sense, the entry ticket into Israeli society. The law of return defines who is eligible for becoming an Israeli. And famously, it defines anyone with a single Jewish grandparent, or anyone married to a Jew, or anyone who converts to Judaism without mentioning which denomination. And this is far more radical than patrilineal descent. Now, it's true that the law of return is not a technical definition of who is a Jew. It doesn't define you as a Jew if you have a single Jewish grandparent. It only says that you are eligible for entry into Israeli society. But in practice, what the law of return has done is grant entry into Israeli Jewish society. And so, the hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants who came in the 90s under the grandfather clause, or the grandparent clause, who were not halachically Jewish, but had a single Jewish grandparent, became absorbed back into the Jewish people. And this is an extraordinary achievement, because the Soviet Jews were really a lost tribe and were cut off from the Jewish people for nearly 70 years. And what the law of return and Zionism did was reabsorb Soviet Jewry back into the Jewish people through the law of return. And it is exactly the law of return that this government intends to constrict, to do away with the grandparent clause. Now, they will not be able to get away with defining eligibility for Israeli citizenship strictly along halachic lines. It will not be anyone with a Jewish mother. It will be anyone with a Jewish parent. But nevertheless, we're already beginning the process of shrinking the classical Zionist intuition of the need to give the Jewish people a broader category of membership than Rabbinic Judaism. This is the beginning of the counter-revolution of Rabbinic Judaism pushing back against Zionism. And that, I believe, is what we're fighting for, along, of course, with liberal democracy.
So we've been seeing these extraordinary protests Saturday night. Is it 19 weeks? Something.
Lost count. Really?
Consistently for months now.
Yes.
Why? Why are people so passionate? What is it that they want?
And we've never seen anything like this in Israel. We've had important protest movements over the decades, but nothing with this consistency and this passion. And there's so much to say about this. So maybe I'll say a few words personally about what it's meant to me to be part of this movement. When you stand among hundreds of thousands of people who are as enraged and fearful for the future of the country as you are, there's this tremendous sense of comfort. And people come away from these demonstrations uplifted. I feel that way. I feel that they're almost religious experiences. And what also I think is really important to emphasize here is that this is an eruption of the Israeli center. This is not coming from the left, and certainly not the far left. This is coming from the mainstream, patriotic Zionist center. And it's not a coincidence that the symbol of the protest movement is the Israeli flag. So think about it for a moment in your political context. If you were to have massive demonstrations against the government, chances are you would not have thousands of giant American flags flying. And I think that part of the tragedy for American society is that one side has expropriated the flag. And that's not the case in Israel. In Israel, all sides still own the flag. And Netanyahu initially tried to portray us as anti-patriotic. And that completely failed. It failed, first of all, because the demonstrations are being led by veterans of the toughest combat units. Every living former IDF commander-in-chief, I believe there are 8 of them, is out on the streets every week. The former heads of the Mossad and the Shin Bet are addressing the demonstrations every week. This is mainstream Zionist Israel telling the government, you are desecrating Zionism. This is not a post-Zionist eruption, quite the opposite. And that's why I think that analogies between Israel and America get lost in translation. Within an Israeli context, we are fighting for the Israeli ethos, and this is a government that's betraying the Israeli ethos. So that's really, I think, important to emphasize. So what's happening there is this sense, the slogan of the demonstrations is one word, busha, which means shame or disgrace. And you can be standing there and suddenly the person next to you will start shouting, busha, busha, and then everyone else around them picks it up as a chant. And then soon you have 100,000 people chanting busha. And I think that really sums up what I'm trying to say about what's happening on the streets, is that we feel that it's the government that is disgracing the name of Israel. And that's the busha, that's the shame. And we're there to salvage everything that we love about Israel. So it's an extraordinary struggle between 2 very different ideas about the state of Israel.
What does this movement mean for Israel?
You know, I've been voting for many years now. I settled into the center. I've been a centrist voter. And the frustration that I've felt all these years with the center is it's amorphous. You know, what is the center? Okay, we're not right-wing and we're not left-wing. You know, it's like, what is Judaism? Well, Jews don't celebrate Christmas. Well, what are we? And that's kind of the center, you know. The center doesn't celebrate Christmas. And these last months have given not just a fighting spirit to the center. The center, we now have a militant center in Israel, which is no less passionate than the right, the far left, the ultra-Orthodox, and now we've got the center in this mix. And the center isn't going anywhere. I believe that this is a political transformation for this generation. And so the first transformation is passion. The center has found its outrage and its determination. The second transformation is that the center has found its ideology. What the center is an affirmation of the classical Zionist idea of a Jewish state as the state of the Jewish people in its messy entirety. And it is an affirmation of Israel as a democratic state in the liberal sense of democracy. Now, what do I mean by liberal? This government believes that it is upholding democracy, and they really believe this. They say that we're going to make Israel more democratic because what happens now is that you can have a democratically elected government representing the majority of the country, and the Supreme Court will come along and knock down bills that the government has passed. So there's something undemocratic about this because no one elected the court. The liberal response to that is democracy does not mean winner take all. A democratically elected government does not have the right to dismantle democratic institutions, to destroy the democratic ethos, to harm minority rights. The liberal understanding of democracy is that it's a delicate dance between the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority. And both of those are precious in a democracy. And it's the job of the non-democratically elected Supreme Court to protect the rights of the minority, whatever that minority is. And so that's the argument over democracy. And just one word about the word liberal. The word liberal in an Israeli context means something different than it does in an American context. Liberal is not left or left of center. Liberal is simply affirming freedom of speech, the rights of minorities, pluralism. And traditionally in Israel, the Likud was a liberal nationalist party. That's how it defined itself. To an American sensibility, that sounds like a contradiction. In an Israeli context, it's a perfectly understandable, recognizable phenomenon. The Likud, under Menachem Begin, Shamir, even Sharon, and under Netanyahu, until coincidentally or not, he got in trouble with the law, the Likud always upheld the independence of the Supreme Court. That was a given. Menachem Begin was probably a more passionate Democrat than Ben-Gurion. And this is something that I know growing up in the American Jewish community, we did not understand. But the traditional Labor Party had certain non-democratic elements in it. There was a kind of a revolutionary spirit. The Likud was not a revolutionary party. It was a liberal nationalist party. It had a very hard line policy on security, obviously on the territories, but in terms of sovereign Israel, whoever was a citizen for the Likud was a citizen. And so there really was this sense of consensus. The definition that I gave of liberal democracy as a balancing act between preserving the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority comes straight out of Menachem Begin. And so there's something almost surreal about the deepest divide in Israeli society being an argument over democracy. Because until a few years ago, I assumed that this is one of the few consensus issues in Israel that united the mainstream right, the center, and the left. Democracy requires a strong and independent court. The Likud would have affirmed that as readily as the left. And so now what Netanyahu has done is realign the Likud with the far right, which always hated the court for all kinds of reasons. The court, according to the far right, hampers the IDF from acting with unrestrained power against terrorism, which is true, but only to a point, because I think that the Supreme Court, through the years, has given the IDF tremendous backing for what it needed to do for security. And that's something that the far nationalist right never acknowledged. But the hostility, the hatred for the court, all these years was confined to the far right, the nationalist far right, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and to the ultra-Orthodox, which saw the court as a rival source of authority to the rabbis. But now we see this hatred for the court coming from the Likud. One of the government ministers, Dudi Amsalem, who is in the justice ministry. We have two justice ministers because Netanyahu needed to hand out political spoils to his loyalists, and so created two justice ministers, two defense ministers, and basically has made a mockery of good governance, but that's a whole other story. So the second justice minister, Dudi Amsalem, who is from the Likud, recently called for putting the chief of the Israeli Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, on trial for treason. The Justice Minister of the State of Israel calling for putting on trial for treason the Chief Justice. Now, that is a civil war. That's something that was so unthinkable under the old Likud that it's a nightmare. And it's a nightmare that I have no historical Israeli context for. So that's why I say it feels surreal. You know, yes, if we're to argue about what a Jewish state means, is it the state of the Jewish people or the state of Judaism? That's a very deep argument that goes back before the state, all the way to the origins of Zionism. What will the future state of Israel be? How, quote, Jewish will the future state be? That's a debate that's been with us all the way through. But a debate over democracy, that's new. And that's something that this government and this prime minister has done to us.
So what do you think will happen? Will a new kind of democracy emerge from all of this?
I'm a short-term pessimist and a middle-term optimist. In Israel, there's no such thing as a long-term. You know, people used to ask me when I'd go out and lecture to American audiences, they'd say, so what do you think, how do you imagine Israel 50 years from now? And I would say, 50 years? I say, I can't imagine Israel 5 years from now. And today I can honestly say, I can't imagine Israel a year from now. I don't know. Is this government going to succeed in undermining the court? If so, we're in a totally new Israel. Are we going to succeed in pushing the government back, as we've done so far? Is that momentum going to continue? My instinct tells me that in the short term, this government will push through certain laws that will be profoundly harmful for the state, whether it's on the law of amending the law of return, whether it's expanding the jurisdiction of rabbinical courts, which this government intends to do, even as it's trying to constrict the reach of the Supreme Courts, it's trying to expand the reach of the rabbinical courts. There's all kinds of mischief that this government is planning, and it's very hard to keep focused on all of the terrible laws that are floating around now in the Knesset. So I think that there is real damage coming, and I don't believe we'll be able to forestall all of it. But I think that the momentum is with us, and I think, God willing, Be'ezrat Hashem, inshallah, we will win the next election. And the polls are showing that there are Likud voters who are wavering, who'd said, you know, we didn't sign up for this. We voted for Netanyahu for security reasons, for economic reasons, and instead security is worse than it's ever been, and certainly worse than it's ever been in the last years. The economy is at risk because of our international standing if this judicial revolution comes through. And so there are more and more Likud voters who are asking uneasy questions. So I think that we're going to win. The question is, how much damage will this government do in the interim?
So let's talk about this democratic movement in Israel and the relationship to diaspora Jewry. American Jews who care about what's going on in Israel, who have very strong opinions about the values that we hold here and wanting to see them as part of civil society in Israel. You wrote an article in February in the Times of Israel that was titled "An Open Letter to Israel's Friends in North America." And in that article, you said diaspora Jews have both the right and the responsibility to speak out against a government that is undermining our society's cohesion and its democratic ethos. It's our responsibility. And you began this article addressing us personally, almost, to Israel's friends in North America, comma. Hello, out there, come and be part of this. It almost says to us. And the three authors of this, Maddie Friedman, Daniel Gordis, and you, of course, began this letter to the diaspora Jewry by saying, "We are taking the unusual step of directly addressing you at a moment of acute crisis in Israel. We write with a sense of anguish and anxiety for the future of our country." What should our role be? What can we do?
I believe that this is the moment to have a reset in diaspora-Israel relations and how we understand the relationship to play out. The old model of Israel, no matter what, I will uncritically support, I think is untenable. And I think it gives birth to the opposite response, which we're seeing rising in parts of the American Jewish community, of unrestrained criticism of Israel, where the whole relationship to Israel is based solely on criticism. I think that both modes are deeply unhealthy. I think it's time for us to relate to each other as Jewish grown-ups who share a deep sense of concern for this shared Jewish project known as the State of Israel. And it's time for Israel to start trusting our diaspora partners. I think after 75 years, it's time for us to not just trust you, but to be interested in what you think. It's astonishing to me that Israelis don't want to know what our closest partners think about what we're doing, how we project in the world. If I don't hear from you how I'm doing, then who am I going to hear from? Then I become a totally provincial and self-referential society. And so first of all, I need you to hold up a mirror to me. Because, when you're caught up in the day-to-day of an existential conflict, it's very hard to objectively see yourself or to see the consequences of some of your actions. Now, much of what Israel does, we have no choice but to do, but certainly not all of what we do. How can you tell us what the consequences are of what we do out in the wider world? So that's on a very practical level. I feel I need you in this conversation. There's a deeper principle here. And the principle is that Israel rightly calls itself the state of the Jewish people. It rightly calls itself the center of the Jewish world. But that comes, to my mind, not only with privileges, the privilege of getting diaspora support, it also comes with responsibilities. And so you quoted our letter there about the responsibilities that diaspora Jews have, but we have responsibilities to make a place at the table, a real place, where diaspora Jews and your concerns will be heard. I don't know what mechanism, what form that will take, but I know that the current relationship is increasingly dysfunctional. And, Israelis play this duplicitous game with the diaspora. When you support my camp, whatever my camp is, left, right, center, then you're not interfering in Israel's internal affairs. You're supporting Israel because you're supporting that camp, which is strengthening Israel and making it possible for Israel to cope with all of our problems. But if you dare to support the other camp, then you are interfering in our internal affairs. And we all the camps, all play the same game. The right is delighted to get support for its think tanks, for the settlements from diaspora Jews, but how dare left-wing American Jews support their causes in Israel? So I think, first of all, we need to establish some basic principles in the relationship. If Israel is the state of the Jewish people, then that requires some mechanism in which we hear you. Now, if you're asking for practical advice or practical direction, the first thing is that on this issue in particular, on the question of the future of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, on the identity of Israel. This is an issue that will impact directly on all of you. If, God forbid, Israel becomes a Jewish version of Hungary or Poland, then what do you do with the flag on the bima? How will American society see American Jewry? How will your children and grandchildren see the flag? These are questions that, this issue, it's not only my issue. And so when we wrote this open letter, what we were trying to say to diaspora Jews is, you have a direct stake in this particular debate. Now, I understand those Israelis who will say, when it comes to security issues, we're the ones who pay the price, and diaspora Jews should not have a say. I personally disagree with that, because I want to hear diaspora voices on any Israeli issue. It doesn't mean that I have to adopt diaspora criticisms or concerns, but I certainly have a responsibility to hear them. But on this issue, I have not only a responsibility, but a need for diaspora partners in helping me figure these issues out. You know, there's no minority community in the world, that's a big statement, but I think it's true, that understands democracy more deeply than the American Jewish community. You have more lawyers, proportionally, I think, than any minority. Jewish organizations are headed by lawyers. You're so successful in navigating the American political system, American society, in creating alliances with other communities because you understand how democracy works. We are democracy challenged in Israel. And that's inevitable for a society that was born in war, that never knew a moment of peace, and most of whose population has origins in societies with no democratic traditions. Probably 90% of Israelis come from families that came either from Eastern Europe or the Middle East, and coming in to a nonstop pressure cooker. And so really, for me, the miracle of Israeli democracy is that it exists at all. And the fact that it's flawed is well, how could it be otherwise? Israeli democracy is what happens when you apply nonstop pressure on democratic institutions and norms. The result is the state of Israel. And Israel, to my mind, is a laboratory for what happens when democracy exists under conditions of extremity. And so we need your experience as this extraordinarily successful minority in the most democratic country. That's what we need. And in terms of how to express that, look, I would love to see, first of all, study groups in American Jewish communities of the issues. What are the issues here in Israel? You know, 6 months ago, I knew nothing about the Israeli legal system. I didn't know how many Supreme Court justices we had. My attitude toward the law was always, the less I have to do with it, the less I know about it, the better. There are those whose job it is to deal with the law. Since this government came to power, Israelis have become a society of amateur legal experts. And there was this joke going around the internet of this person writing that overhearing a shouting match on the night of the Seder from the next apartment, where the wife is yelling at the husband, "You idiot, in New Zealand, Supreme Court justices are elected by committee." And we all know those things now. We know the differences. We know how it works in Germany, how it works in the US. And we had to learn it because the government initially said, the reforms will simply align us with what's happening in Germany and the US and New Zealand. And so study the issues. Be part of the internal Israeli conversation. on this particular crisis. So that's the most basic thing. Read an Israeli news site as often as you can, every day if possible. Read the Times of Israel, which I think is the best news in English from Israel by far, and has the best commentary that I know. So that's one level. I would love to see synagogue missions coming to the Israeli democracy movement. Come participate in a Saturday night demonstration. It will be one of the most powerful Zionist experiences you've ever had. And it's happening now. And if not synagogue groups, that's maybe a little more difficult to organize, there should be groups of Jewish leaders coming, groups of rabbis coming. So that's something else. The weekly demonstrations in solidarity with the democracy movement that are happening, that happen at the local Israeli consulates, and it shouldn't only be Israelis living in the diaspora. It should also be diaspora Jews. And these are demonstrations that are affirmative. They're not anti-Israel demonstrations. They're pro-Israel demonstrations. I would love to see thousands of Israeli flags in the streets of major American cities. So those are just some ideas, and I would love to see a task force. Why hasn't the American Jewish community established a task force for democracy, for Israeli democracy? And how do we engage with the Israeli democratic movement? Now, I understand that, the major American Jewish organizations need to keep some line of communication with the Israeli government. But this can be done in unofficial ways. And so let's start figuring out ways of how American Jewry can actively support this movement and participate in it.
I love what you're saying, and I love this idea. I'm kind of envisioning all of us going on a trip to Israel immediately for for a Saturday night experience of real Israel that, as you said, is really unparalleled. I mean, we could never be part of Israel in the way that we could right now.
Yeah, and come before we win, and it's all over.
But I think one of the real issues that liberal American Jews have dealt with for a long time is a feeling that there is no place for our voice. The values that we hold and the methods that there are to express those never end up at the core of the conversations around Israeli civil society or around Israeli democracy, because somehow it always reverts back to, bigger issues, security, external, issues of democracy. And right now we stand at this very interesting crossroads where the values of inclusivity, whether it's for Arabs in Israel or women, liberal Jews, LGBTQ folks who are living there, all these ways that we have been so proud of Israel being an open democracy seem to be at risk. And I think, though it feels very frightening, we also feel like we don't have a way to make a difference.
But I think that what we're missing here is that part of Israeli society that's represented by the democracy movement, and it's a major part of Israeli society. I don't know, is it 40%, is it 50%? But those are the percentages we're talking about. That part of Israeli society is desperate to engage with American Jews, with the diaspora. And there have been delegations sent to the diaspora by the democracy movement, and this is an opportunity, and you have an active, energized part of Israeli society that's looking to the diaspora for partnership, and that's why this is really a transformative moment.
Well, and I think your letter ended so beautifully, the three of you writers, with these words: "We and our families, along with many tens of thousands of other Israelis, are in the streets every week, demanding the government end its war against our democratic values and institutions. We need your voice to help us preserve Israel as a state, both Jewish and democratic, with blessings from Jerusalem. And then you sign off. You know, it feels like friends, cousins, relatives just writing this beautiful letter that we've received in the mail asking us, please, to come and visit, please, to participate.
Well, I'm very touched by the way you frame that. And I have to tell you that this is my last night on a 3-week lecture tour, and I'm astonished at how this letter resonated, far beyond what we imagined it would do. And in the organized Jewish community, everybody seems to have at least heard of it, and it really helped. I think helped at least get many people to ask questions that they might not have allowed themselves to ask before. And even though I don't think it should be this way, it turned out that it was necessary for many people in the Jewish community to, quote, get permission from Israelis to express your opposition and your anxiety, and in some way, at least emotionally, be part of this moment.
Well, it's very powerful, I think, for us to be invited, as you say. I hope that there will be many more opportunities for invitation so that we really do feel welcome to participate, because there's so much love for Israel here, and people really do care about the outcome of all of this, and being invited to be in the dialogue seems to be necessary. I think it resonated so much because the 3 authors were originally American Jews who chose to move to Israel, which is not unique to the 3 of you. There are many Americans who have made Aliyah, but who, from an insider perspective, both on American culture and on Israeli culture, have chosen to navigate the challenges of living in Israel for decades, of raising children in Israel, and of observing Israeli society from a centrist sort of perspective that we can understand. Yes. It's very relevant to us, and I think the 3 authors of this letter have been able to speak through this letter and other writings and other observations, but to speak to American Jews in a way from deep within Israel, deep within a love of Israel that has really resonated here.
And a love for the communities we come from.
Right.
And a respect for the communities we come from. I think that's really crucial. What has been so often missing in the relationship is Israeli respect for American Jewry, which is expressed in all kinds of ways. And so putting respect back on the agenda, I think, is crucial for beginning the process of moving this relationship to a deeper level.
It's been very powerful. Let me ask you one final question. As always, the world is watching Israel. And oftentimes when we say that, I think we mean it not in the best way. The world is watching Israel and kind of unfairly evaluating what's happening in Israel, or holding Israel to an unfair standard of excellence in some way that no country, no government, no society could ever live up to. And yet, Israel is supposed to live up to it in spades. But I don't think it's exactly like that this time. It's different somehow. The world is watching Israel, and by that I mean the world is watching what a pure form of democracy might produce, or a new kind of democracy might produce, or democracy in its most challenged sense from within might produce. What do you think the lessons are that will come out of this, not only for Israel's cousins in the diaspora, but for the whole world, as the world tries to understand a country at 75 years old, struggling with many different realities and personalities and needs, and how Israel comes to maintain and uphold the values which are so central to the state of Israel over these 75 years?
So in one sense, what we're going through is very familiar in the contemporary scene. A democracy that is facing an internal threat, which can't be blamed. In the past, we could blame the security situation on the need to constrict democratic norms. This is entirely self-generated. And this is a very familiar model. There's Poland, there's Hungary, there's Turkey. The United States kind of went through your own challenge to democracy. And so now it's our turn. And I think it's important for us in Israel to have some global context for what we're going through, that we are part of a struggle on several levels for the integrity of democratic institutions, for the integrity of the truth. I don't know if you have this term in English. In Hebrew, it's called fake news, and Netanyahu has poisoned Israeli political discourse with lies, and a large part of the Israeli public has been deliberately manipulated, and the result is that much of Israeli discourse, as happened in America, has been dumbed down. And in Israel's case, our survival depends on an alert and intelligent citizenry, intelligent and alert to its problems and the issues that it's facing. When you inject fake news, you are threatening the ability of the society to respond in an intelligent way to threat. This is a real security threat. The poison that Netanyahu has injected into the political culture. So it is, in that sense, very familiar to other societies, and I think that's useful for us in several ways. First of all, to give us a little bit of humility. This isn't. We like to think of ourselves, and I think this is true for Jews generally. We're either the best or the worst, and sometimes we're just really like everyone else. And in this case, to some extent, we're like lots of other countries. What's different, I think, here, and what gives me a great deal of pride, is the consistency and the passion of this protest movement. It really reminds me of the spirit with which Israelis go to war, and the organizers actually speak in this language of this is miluim, this is reserve duty. And when you go to reserve duty, if there's a war, it can be open-ended. There are any number of people from the high-tech sector, from academia, who have taken an open-ended leave of absence to devote themselves full-time to this movement. It's a phenomenon that I don't know whether this exists anywhere else, and that this shows no sign of let-up. If anything, the demonstrations are getting stronger and certainly are spreading to other parts of Israeli society. So what I see coming out of this is a deep Israeli affirmation of what we took for granted, which was democracy. I see a deep reaffirmation of the love for Israel, which we also took for granted. It was always there, but now it's when you stand to lose something precious, you realize what it means to you. And the fear that those of us who are involved in this movement have, is that we could, God forbid, lose the Israel that we knew. And so there's this deep sense of protectiveness that's emerging, and a ferocity of love for the state. And I think that's something that I didn't quite sense in the movement to stop Trump, which had other wonderful qualities to it. But it wasn't at least not consciously, wasn't this outpouring of love and embrace for America, that America could be lost. And that was missing for me from much of the rhetoric and the protests. And that's front and center in Israel. So this is a very powerful moment in many ways. And while it isn't unique in the sense of defending an autocratic threat to democracy, I think it may well be unique in the way in which we're defending Israeli democracy, which is by a strong affirmation of patriotism. And it's that combination of patriotism and democratic passion that really defines this moment in Israel.
Tikva, that's what it gives us. Hope for the future. Enormous thanks to you for sharing your observations, your wisdom with us, and also for inviting us to participate in the conversation. I think it's such an important message. I look forward to bringing busloads of Congregation Shereth Israel members to Israel. I hope you'll meet us on a Saturday night soon.
I would love that.
In the street.
It was just wonderful to engage with you.
And thank you also for upholding the legacy of Rabbi Wiener, who encouraged us and challenged us to engage in whatever is happening in the world at large and in the world in terms of what was important to the Jewish community, how we could participate in a larger world. So it was a beautiful way to honor Rabbi Wiener's legacy and to learn with you tonight. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being here.